you, mister. Told me I got what it takes. She said I'll turn you one son into something strong. Play the song with the funky break. And go-kart Mozart was checking out the weather chart, see if it was safe outside. And little early birdie came by in his curly-whirly and asked me if I needed a ride. Wrapped up like a deuce, another runner in the night, blinded by the light. She got down, but she never got tight. She's gonna make it to the night.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? The show starts in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Welcome. Before we begin this shocking true history mystery, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you hit that subscribe button because it takes a huge amount of research, record digging, and verification to bring stories like this back from the shadows of forgotten history. Tonight, we're uncovering the unbelievable tale from 1859, Georgia, where a single enslaved man reportedly blinded 19 overseers using one method so strange, so impossible, and so feared that it disappeared from official records for decades. He was known only by a single name, the way most enslaved people were: short, simple, and chosen by someone who owned him. But those who worked beside him in the Georgia fields of 1859 knew there was something different about him from the beginning. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest. In fact, he barely spoke at all, even when spoken to. He carried a calm around him that felt unnatural in a place built on fear, punishment, and the constant pressure of survival. Men and women whispered that he seemed to think before every move he made, as if he were always 5 steps ahead of everyone else, overseers included. When he first arrived on the plantation, brought in from another estate after a mysterious fire that no one wanted to talk about, the other enslaved workers watched him carefully. He didn't carry the defeated posture many new arrivals had. He walked with quiet caution, his eyes scanning every corner of his new surroundings, not with fear, but with calculation. He learned the layout of the plantation faster than most. He memorized the routines of the overseers almost instantly. He could predict when someone would enter the barn or when the dogs were being prepared for patrol. It wasn't long before people began whispering that the man saw things long before they happened. One detail that stood out to everyone: he listened more than he spoke. While others traded stories, secrets, and survival tips during the night hours, he kept to himself, sharpening sticks, weaving small objects out of discarded materials, and drawing designs in the dirt that the morning footsteps erased before anyone else noticed them. No one knew where he learned to make traps, knots, or small mechanisms, skills that didn't belong to someone raised entirely in bondage. His hands worked with precision. His movements were controlled. Nothing about him was careless. Even the overseers took notice. They didn't like cleverness. One of them once said, "That one's got too much mind behind those eyes." But the man never broke rules. He never talked back. He never made mistakes that could get him punished. It was as if he had studied overseers his whole life and knew exactly how to obey, just enough to stay invisible. Yet, there was something unsettling beneath his calm. People began to notice that the man rarely looked anyone directly in the eyes, except the overseers. With them, he had a habit of staring for a moment too long, a moment just uncomfortable enough to make the other enslaved workers shift nervously. His gaze wasn't angry. It wasn't challenging. It was something else, something measured, like he was reading them, learning them, waiting. He was often found standing alone at night, staring out toward the tree line, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Some said he was planning escape. Others said he was waiting for a sign. A few whispered that he was protecting them from something they didn't yet understand. Whatever he was planning, he kept it locked behind a silence thicker than the August heat. But the most unsettling part, the part no one could explain, was how he always seemed to appear in places he wasn't expected to be. One moment he'd be in the fields. A moment later someone would swear they saw him near the stables. Another person would insist he had just walked past the smokehouse. And yet no one had seen him run, rush, or panic. His movements were quiet and deliberate, like someone who had long ago mastered the art of being unnoticed. It wasn't until the first overseer went blind that people began to understand what that intelligence, that silence, that observation might have been preparing for. The enslaved workers started piecing together things they had overlooked. The man's strange warnings, his sudden disappearances, the way he tracked each overseer's weaknesses with frightening accuracy. But back then, before everything unfolded, he was simply the quiet man with sharp eyes, careful hands, and a mind far too dangerous for the world he was trapped in. He was the man no one understood, and the man 19 overseers should have feared long before they did. The tension on the plantation had been rising long before anyone understood why, but it became unmistakable in the months leading up to the first incident. Overseers in 1859 Georgia were known for cruelty, but on this plantation their brutality had escalated into something almost obsessive. Some said it was the pressure of harvest season. Others said it was fear of rebellion. But those who lived under the overseers' watchful eyes knew the truth. These men were getting crueler because they felt control slipping away, even if they couldn't explain it. Punishments grew harsher. Whippings became more frequent. Overseers patrolled fields late into the night, barking orders even when no work was being done. They snapped at one another. They kept their hands on their weapons more often. They jumped at small sounds. Something unseen was eroding their confidence, and they were desperate to reassert dominance. Among the enslaved workers, quiet whispers traveled from person to person. Someone had overheard two overseers arguing about tools going missing. Another claimed a horse suddenly refused to go near the barn at dusk. A third had seen one of the overseers stumbling in the field, shouting that someone was watching him. Many blamed the man with the silent steps and thoughtful eyes, the newcomer who never said more than a few words and seemed to know everything before it happened. But no one dared say it out loud. The overseers themselves grew paranoid of him. They weren't afraid of a physical attack. Men like them believed their power was absolute. But they were unsettled by his confidence. He never looked intimidated, never rushed, never made mistakes. They sensed his intelligence, even if they couldn't articulate it. And rather than confront him directly, they released their rising fear onto everyone else. They punished entire groups for small infractions. They forced workers to repeat tasks until exhaustion. They changed schedules unpredictably, turning daily routines into chaos. But the more they tried to tighten control, the more strange things began to happen. Lanterns that had been hung carefully would crash to the ground when no wind was blowing. Tools left locked inside sheds turned up scattered across the fields. Horses spooked for no reason. Overseers swore they heard footsteps behind them, only to find empty space when they turned around. One man claimed he felt someone breathing over his shoulder while he slept. Another insisted he saw a shadow move under his bed when he knew no one else was there. The plantation owner dismissed all of it as weakness and superstition, but the overseers didn't. Their tempers grew short. Their fear turned inward, poisoning their minds. They began to blame each other for the strange occurrences. Twice, drunken arguments erupted into fistfights. One overseer quit without warning and fled the property before sunrise. The workers watched from the shadows, realizing that something, or someone, was steadily dismantling the overseer's confidence. The quiet man at the center of it all remained unfazed. He continued doing his work, saying nothing, observing everything. He watched the overseers crumble under the weight of their own fear, and he waited. Not once did he react to their violence, not even when they tried to provoke him. He carried himself like someone who already knew the ending long before the first act had begun. And then, as the nights grew colder and the air sharpened around the plantation, the overseers started to notice something else. Their eyesight was changing. At first it was subtle. Difficulty adjusting in dim light, moments of blurred vision, headaches that seemed to pulse behind the eyes. They blamed fatigue, the season, the work. But it wasn't long before the change became impossible to ignore, and one by one, they started to fear that something was happening to them. Something deliberate. The tension reached a breaking point. But the most chilling part was that no one yet understood what was coming next. No one guessed that 19 men would soon lose their vision entirely, and that all of it would trace back to the same quiet man who moved like a whisper through the fields. It happened on a humid afternoon when the air felt heavy enough to crush a person's lungs. The first overseer to fall victim was a man known for his temper, someone who believed fear was the only language the enslaved workers understood. That day, he stormed through the fields shouting, throwing tools aside, demanding to know who had moved a crate he'd left outside the barn. No one answered him. No one dared. But the quiet man, the newcomer, stood off to the side, watching with those unblinking eyes that seemed to record everything. The overseer's frustration built until he was red in the face. Witnesses later said he began rubbing his eyes as if dust had blown into them, though the air was still. He cursed under his breath, squinting hard. At first it seemed trivial, eyes irritated by sweat or pollen. But within minutes, the overseer stumbled. His voice cracked as he demanded someone bring him water. But when a young worker approached with a bucket, the overseer recoiled violently, shouting that someone had thrown a cloth over his face. The boy stood frozen, confused. There was nothing on the overseer's face, nothing covering his eyes, nothing blocking his vision. The overseer blinked rapidly, rubbing harder, insisting the world had dimmed around him, that the sunlight had vanished. Panic crept into his voice, a sound none of the workers had ever heard from him. His hands shook as he reached out blindly, and the workers instinctively stepped back, unsure what they were witnessing. He turned in frantic circles, trying to focus on anything. A tree, a fence post, a shadow, but all he saw was a spreading darkness swallowing the world. He fell to his knees, breathing hard, muttering that something was inside his eyes, something alive. Then he shouted a name, the quiet man's name, as if he had suddenly understood something no one else could. But the newcomer didn't flinch. He didn't approach, didn't respond, didn't show any expression at all. He simply stood there, hands by his side, watching the overseer crumble. Word spread quickly. The plantation owner ordered the doctor to examine the overseer. The doctor arrived with his bag of instruments and a sense of authority that evaporated the moment he looked into the man's eyes. The doctor found no injury, no infection, no damage at all, just eyes that no longer worked, perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, and completely blind. The overseer tried to describe the moment it happened, but his story sounded impossible. He said that for a split second, he saw a flash, like sunlight reflecting off something, coming from where the quiet man stood. He said the light wasn't natural. It wasn't a glare or a reflection or a flame. It was something sharp and direct, like someone aimed it at him. But the doctor dismissed it as delirium. Still, the overseer wasn't the only one noticing odd details. Some workers whispered that they had seen the quiet man bending over small objects at night, crafting something from scraps of metal, cloth, or glass. Others said they'd seen him study the overseer's faces closely, as if memorizing them. One person claimed they saw him lift something small between his fingers before dawn, holding it up to the first light, as if testing it. But nothing ever turned up. The overseer's blindness remained a mystery. The plantation owner refused to believe anything supernatural or deliberate had occurred. He chalked it up to illness, sent the overseer away, and insisted everyone keep working. But the workers knew better. They felt something shift the moment the overseer went blind. The fields became quieter. The birds seemed to avoid the area. Even the dogs stopped barking at night. Most unsettling of all was how the quiet man behaved afterward. He showed no satisfaction, no fear, no excitement. He simply resumed his routine, silent and focused. If he had caused the overseer's blindness, by trick, by skill, by something no one understood, he gave no sign of it. But the overseers noticed him now. They watched him more closely than ever. They muttered his name in low voices. They tightened their grips on their whips. Not out of authority, but out of fear. None of them yet realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. The first overseer was only the beginning. 19 would eventually meet the same fate, and the quiet man would still never raise a hand, never shout, never fight. Whatever he had done, or whatever people believed he could do, it all began with that first man's sudden plunge into darkness, a moment no one could explain and no one would forget. At first, the connection between the quiet man and the blinded overseer was only a whisper, an uneasy suspicion that no one dared repeat too loudly. But as the days passed, those whispers grew into something heavier, something that settled over the plantation like a fog no wind could lift. The moment the overseer lost his sight, people began replaying every strange detail. They had ever noticed the man's silence, his sharp observation, the way he always seemed to appear where he wasn't expected, and his uncanny ability to predict the overseer's movements. It all began to feel less like coincidence and more like design. The other overseers felt it first. They didn't admit it. Men in their position rarely confessed fear, but their behavior changed. Some stopped walking alone at night. Others refused to turn their backs when the quiet man was near. A few even began carrying lanterns in broad daylight, claiming it helped them see the workers better, though everyone knew the lanterns were for comfort, not sight. They all remembered how the first overseer had called out the quiet man's name during his panic, and the memory clung to them like a stain. They watched him from a distance now, tracking him with wary eyes. Every movement he made was scrutinized, every step measured. If he paused too long while working, they stiffened. If he glanced their way, they stiffened even more. One overseer swore the man's eyes glinted strangely when the sun hit them. Another claimed he saw the man holding something small and shiny in his hand before tucking it quickly out of sight. None of them had proof. But proof didn't matter anymore. Fear had already chosen its target. The enslaved workers, on the other hand, reacted in a different way. They began noticing how the quiet man always lingered near the edges of the fields, as if anticipating the overseer's path before they arrived. Some recalled moments when he subtly motioned for them to step aside just before an overseer appeared. Others remembered the way he warned them without words, through a look, a gesture, a shift of position. Slowly, quietly, they began to realize the man had been studying the overseers long before anything happened. Not out of malice, but out of preparation. A few workers even wondered aloud whether he had been planning something all along, something to even the balance in a world where the scales had never once tipped in their favor. But no one knew what he was capable of. No one knew how he could do something so precise without being seen, and no one dared ask him. Meanwhile, the overseers searched for explanations that didn't involve calling the phenomenon what it truly was: targeted. Some blamed contaminated food, though only one man had fallen ill. Others suggested a curse, though they laughed nervously after saying the word. A few whispered that the quiet man had learned something, some method, some trick, from a place he'd lived before. That theory spread the fastest, because it allowed them to believe the danger was human, not supernatural. Still, their fear grew with every passing hour. The plantation became a place of restless tension. Overseers twitched at the sound of footsteps behind them. They snapped at shadows. They slept with their backs to walls. It was as if the darkness that swallowed the first overseer's vision had begun creeping into their minds. One night, two overseers approached the quiet man near the stables. They didn't touch him. They didn't threaten him. They simply circled him like hunters afraid of their own prey. They asked where he had been during the moment the first overseer's sight failed. They asked what he had been holding. They asked why he never spoke. But the man's silence unnerved them more than any answer could have. He stood there, calm and controlled, his expression unreadable. Eventually they left, unsettled, convinced more than ever that he knew something they didn't. And then came the moment that cemented the link in everyone's mind. A second overseer complained that his eyes were hurting, just as the first had. A strange buzzing sensation, he said, a dimming of the world around him. He blamed the light, the weather, anything he could think of. But when he looked up and saw the quiet man standing at the end of the path, watching him, he froze. His face drained of color. He turned away quickly, as if breaking eye contact might save him. It didn't. Within minutes, the dimming became darkness, and the overseer collapsed into the dirt, shouting for help. The workers knew what had happened even before he hit the ground. The overseers knew too, and though no one could explain it, no doctor, no owner, no preacher, everyone agreed on one thing. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. Two men blinded. Both had crossed paths with the same silent figure mere moments before. The overseer's fear turned to panic. The worker's whispers turned to certainty. And the quiet man, he simply continued his work, as if nothing at all had happened. But something had. Something that would spread through 19 men, before the plantation ever understood the truth. The rumor of a trick began long before anyone understood what it actually meant. After the second overseer went blind, people started paying closer attention to the smallest details. The way the quiet man handled scraps of metal, how he studied sunlight, how he'd tilt his head like he was measuring angles only he could see. He never carried weapons. He never raised a hand. He never fought or resisted. Yet every overseer who lost his sight had one thing in common. Each had been near him shortly before it happened. Close enough for him to look at them, or close enough for him to use something no one ever saw clearly. Some workers recalled moments when he seemed to carefully place or hide something in the dirt. Others remembered him picking up tiny objects that looked like nothing. Shards of glass, bits of broken lanterns, pieces of mirror swallowed by mud and time. He would clean them quietly at night, rubbing them gently against his sleeve, creating surfaces that reflected the smallest glimmer of light. No one knew what he was doing, but his hands moved with precision, intention, and practiced skill, like someone following instructions burned into memory. It wasn't until someone spotted him early one morning, standing alone by the edge of the fields, with a tiny fragment of glass held between his fingers, that the whispers began to take shape. The sun had just risen, casting sharp beams across the land. The man lifted the fragment, letting the sunlight hit it at a precise angle. The moment the light passed through it, it shot across the field in a thin, bright streak, so brief that anyone who blinked would have missed it. The worker watching him froze. There was nothing violent or malicious in the gesture. It was delicate, calculated, almost scientific. But the worker couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the edge of something dangerous. That was when the idea of the trick started to spread. No one understood it fully, but everyone sensed it had something to do with light. Reflected light, concentrated light, controlled light. Something so subtle the overseers never saw it coming, but strong enough to damage their vision if timed with perfect precision. And the quiet man, he always timed things perfectly. The overseers, of course, refused to believe they could be harmed by something so small, so insignificant. They insisted it had to be disease, or poison, or even some kind of curse whispered by the workers. But deep down, a few of them remembered the quiet man's calm stare, the way sunlight sometimes flickered strangely near him, the way he always seemed to stand exactly where the morning light hit the hardest. They remembered how the blinded overseers all described the same final sensation, a sudden brightness, like a flash they couldn't escape, The plantation owner dismissed the theory outright. He claimed no man, especially an enslaved one, could create a method so precise. But the overseers doubted him. They knew the quiet man's intelligence ran deeper than anyone had ever acknowledged. They had watched him navigate the plantation with silent strategy. They had seen him solve problems others failed to notice. They had watched him observe them with unsettling focus. To think he had found a way to use something as harmless as light against them. It terrified them more than any weapon could. One overseer became obsessed with proving the trick didn't exist. He confronted the quiet man, searched his pockets, turned out his bedding, tore apart the corner of his sleeping area, but he found nothing, no glass, no metal, no tools. What he didn't realize was that the quiet man never kept anything. He created what he needed, used it instantly, and discarded it into the earth where no one would think to look. The plantation was full of broken glass, lantern fragments, and polished surfaces. He simply took what was already there and transformed it with knowledge no one expected him to have. The workers saw him do it occasionally, testing angles of light on the water bucket, studying reflections on the metal parts of farm tools, examining how sunlight bounced off the river near the property. He didn't hide his actions, but he also didn't draw attention to them. He was simply learning, refining, preparing, and soon something remarkable became clear. The trick wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was a method, one he could replicate with exact timing and flawless execution. He knew the overseers' routines, where they walked, when they turned their heads. He knew the direction of the rising and setting sun. He knew how to stand in the exact spot, where the light would align with a shard in his hand. He didn't need to touch them. He didn't need to confront them. He didn't need strength or weapons. All he needed was one beam of light, one reflection, one perfect moment. And with that, he began dismantling the overseers one by one, leaving behind a plantation full of men terrified of something they couldn't see, couldn't prove, and couldn't stop. The quiet man had discovered a power that required no force, only knowledge, patience, and precision. A trick so unbelievable that even after 19 men lost their sight, no one ever fully understood how he had done it. Only that he had, and that the trick, whatever it was, worked flawlessly every single time. He knew that any confrontation with the overseers had to feel like an accident, like a moment no one could have predicted or prevented, because open resistance meant the kind of punishment no human body could survive. So he began studying the plantation's routines more closely than anyone else. He watched how the overseers leaned over the railings when checking cotton bags, how they shaded their eyes with their hands in the late Georgia sun, and how their tempers made them rush into situations without thinking. He learned the rhythm of their footsteps, the way they barked orders, the exact moments when their attention shifted from power to carelessness, and slowly, silently, he began to build a method that seemed impossible for anyone to trace back to him, because nothing he planned looked like rebellion. To an outsider, it would look like the plantation simply turning against the very men who tried to control it. The trick he relied on was not strength or speed or even luck. It was patience. He realized that everyone else underestimated patience because it looked like weakness. But in reality, it was the one weapon the enslaved had that overseers never understood. While they exploded with fury, he observed quietly. While they rushed toward problems, he waited. While they acted without thought, he learned every angle of a space before stepping into it. He used the landscape itself, the glare of the sun, the thickness of summer air, the blinding reflection of metal tools left out in the fields, to manipulate where the overseers were looking and how long they kept their eyes open. Every detail that seemed harmless to others became valuable to him. He turned his surroundings into a silent alley, something he could control even when he could control nothing else. What made his method so shocking was its subtlety. It never appeared deliberate. The overseers would bend down at the wrong moment, step into the wrong patch of light, or grab the wrong object at the wrong angle. What followed would look like misfortune or clumsiness, and that was exactly what he wanted. He understood the plantation's superstitions too, the whispering fear that some places were cursed or that strange accidents carried signs from forces beyond human comprehension. The more accidents that happened, the more fear spread. Whispered conversations grew behind cabin walls. Overseers stopped walking alone at dusk. Even the plantation owners began to wonder if the land itself had become hostile. And all the while, he kept moving through each day with the same calm expression, the same quiet obedience, no different from the man they assumed he was. But the truth was that inside him lived a sharp, relentless clarity. He had discovered a way to make power tilt, even if only slightly, in the opposite direction. He had discovered a way to turn fear back on the people who created it. The trick he perfected depended on their arrogance, the belief that no one beneath them could ever outthink them. And he used that arrogance like a mirror, reflecting it right back at them. What happened next would turn him into a whispered legend across Georgia, but at this stage he remained invisible in the way only the most strategic minds know how to be. His silence was not submission. It was strategy. It was survival. And soon, it would become something far greater. Word of the strange accidents spread faster than cotton prices shifting in town. By the time the sixth overseer suffered the same sudden, inexplicable loss of sight, the plantation was wrapped in a tension so thick it changed the way people breathed. Overseers, who once strutted with absolute confidence, now walked with jittery caution, constantly turning their heads, as if something unseen moved behind them. Even the fields felt different. The usual sounds of cracking whips and barking commands faded into quieter, uncertain voices. Nothing frightened men of power more than losing control, and nothing stripped control away faster than a threat they could not explain. Rumors spilled into every corner of plantation life, each one stranger than the last. Some claimed it was the humidity, a strange fever carried in the air. Others swore the wells were cursed, or that certain tools held bad omens. A few whispered that the land itself was revolting after decades of cruelty. No one dared say aloud what they feared most, that someone among the enslaved had done it, and worse, that he had done it without ever being seen. These rumors became stronger once the pattern emerged. The accidents always happened in daylight. They always involved the same sudden flash, the same moment of disorientation, the same cry of shock, and they always happened when the overseer was alone or turned away from others. It was as if something inside the fields waited patiently for the exact second a man was vulnerable. The overseers tried to blame one another at first, accusing their fellow supervisors of carelessness or sabotage. But the truth was too blatant to deny. They were all frightened, They carried lanterns at noon. They wore wide, brimmed hats even on cloudy days. Some tied strips of cloth over their eyes as protection, stumbling around foolishly in front of the enslaved workers who had once trembled before them. Yet none of their precautions stopped the accidents. The unseen force, real or imagined, continued its work. The enslaved community, bound by silence stronger than any chain, pretended to know nothing. But in the cabins at night, quiet conversations traveled like smoke. They spoke softly, not out of fear of punishment, but because they understood the delicate balance they were witnessing. They couldn't risk giving away even the smallest hint that they had noticed the pattern. For them, every overseer blinded was not a tale of violence, but a moment where the world seemed to shift in their favor, even if only by a fraction. They did not know how he was doing it, but they knew someone among them was fighting with a mind sharper than any blade they'd ever seen. The white families of the nearest town soon caught wind of the situation. Merchants, travelers, and even preachers discussed the plantation as if it sat atop cursed ground. Some speculated about spiritual explanations, warnings from heaven or punishments for sin. Others blamed the war stirring the air across the South, believing unrest among enslaved people had awakened something dangerous. Plantation owners across the region tightened their defenses, hired extra men, and demanded stricter obedience, though none of them would admit they were acting out of fear. What made the situation even stranger was that the affected overseers could describe almost nothing. Each could only recall a flash, sometimes from a tool, sometimes from the sun, sometimes from something they couldn't name, and then darkness, no attacker, no struggle, no clear memory that could guide anyone to an answer. And that made the mystery grow even bigger, because when powerful men fall without seeing who brought them down, their imagination becomes their own worst enemy. That fear became the true weapon, far more powerful than the trick itself. For the boy behind these events, keeping this fear alive required discipline. He avoided drawing attention, avoided standing too close to the incidents, avoided being seen watching. More importantly, he avoided pride. He understood that the moment he enjoyed his success too openly, he would lose the careful balance he had created. His goal was not to be celebrated. It was to create a disruption so deep that it shook the entire foundation of control around him. And as the overseers began refusing to work without armed backup, as the owner hired priests to bless the land, as whispers of revolt spread among neighboring plantations, it became clear that the balance was indeed shifting. For the first time, the overseers feared the fields. They feared the light. They feared the silence. They feared the thing they could not see, and the boy who ensured they never would. As fear grew heavier than the summer air, the plantation owner gathered every overseer and announced a plan that was supposed to restore order, though even he didn't believe the confidence in his own voice. They were going to catch the man responsible, publicly, quickly, and brutally enough to send a message across every row of cotton and every neighboring plantation. But the moment he said it, everyone knew the plan carried a problem so large it made his words hollow. They had no suspect, no evidence, no witness. Nothing but a pattern of accidents everyone whispered about yet no one could explain. Still, they felt they had to try. Pride demanded it. Reputation demanded it. The system that controlled thousands of lives demanded it. Horses were brought out at dawn, lanterns tied to saddles, rifles loaded, and dogs released across the fields in long, zigzagging lines. Overseers walked with their backs pressed against one another, refusing to turn around alone. Men who once mocked fear now trembled at the sound of rustling grass. They shouted commands no one obeyed, because none of them trusted each other more than they trusted their own panic. Workers were ordered to stand in tight groups, while the men searched every cabin, every tool shed, every furrow of earth. They overturned food pots, ripped open straw pallets, cut open bags of feed, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. But the search only revealed more confusion. The boy responsible was nowhere near the scene of any incident. No strange objects were found. No hidden tools. No secret writings. Nothing to connect him to the accidents. And that absence of evidence made the overseers even more terrified, because it meant he was operating in plain sight. It meant he needed nothing but opportunity and timing. It meant any one of them could be next at the exact moment they least expected it. That fear turned into bitterness, and bitterness into desperation. With each failed day of searching, their behavior grew more frantic, unpredictable, and self-destructive. They punished the wrong people, accused each other of incompetence, and guessed their own senses until exhaustion made them careless. The boy watched all of this from the edges of the fields, blending into the rhythm of daily labor. His stillness protected him, his silence shielded him. He understood that chasing him was like chasing sunlight, always present but impossible to grab. He never stepped forward, never revealed a single hint that might confirm their suspicions, and that restraint made him untouchable. He slipped between routines like a shadow, always calm, always unnoticed. That invisibility was his greatest defense, and the overseers unknowingly helped him maintain it through their own panic. As the search continued, the local townspeople arrived in groups to witness the so-called manhunt. Their presence only added pressure. Plantation owners couldn't admit they were losing control. Overseers couldn't admit they were afraid, and none of them wanted to leave until the mystery was solved. But weeks passed, and the boy they pursued remained nothing more than a rumor walking quietly among them. With every failed attempt, the tension swelled further, turning the entire plantation into a place where silence felt louder than any voice. The owner eventually brought in a group of hired men, people who didn't know the land, the workers, or the unspoken rules of the fields. They searched with louder footsteps and harsher voices, kicking up dust as if force alone could uncover the truth. But they too found nothing, their confidence dissolving as quickly as the overseers had. They left frustrated, and the owner was left humiliated. The land seemed to reject every effort made to control it, as if it had aligned itself with the unseen force they were hunting. Meanwhile, the enslaved community knew the truth, but never spoke it aloud. They communicated only with glances and small gestures, honoring the unspoken pact that protected the boy. They made no sudden movements, no careless whispers, no hints that might draw suspicious eyes. Some silently altered their routines to help him stay invisible. Others kept watch for unpredictable overseers. They moved as one, united not by fear, but by the shared understanding that this boy was doing what none of them could do openly. He was shifting the balance, even if only slightly. By the end of the 4th week, the overseers were more frightened than before the search had begun. They slept in groups, avoided walking alone, and refused to stand near reflective objects without checking them twice. The plantation owner stopped speaking confidently and began avoiding eye contact. The workers sensed the change in posture, the shorter breaths, the anxious pacing. Power had shifted. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough to crack the illusion of control. And the boy they hunted never left, never ran, never hid. He simply continued working quietly, blending into the world around him, while the fear he created worked harder than he ever needed to.
Plantation records from northeastern Alabama reveal an entry dated March 1856 that defies explanation. 12 men, armed.
Salute.